Hi, my name is Hannah Brown, and I am excited to present to you today a study that I conducted with Dr. Susan Jacobson and Dr. Glenn Israel about newspaper coverage of oyster restoration before, during, and after phases of the BP spill. And we're calling this Catastrophe and Environmental Restoration, analyzing frames and sources of oyster restoration news stories. So, what I'd like to do today is to start by going over our three key motivations for doing this study. I'll talk about our methods, findings, takeaways, and then end with some recommendations for policymakers and practitioners. So, our first key motivation is that 85% of global oyster populations have been lost in recent decades. And that's important because oysters are both an ecological and cultural keystone species. Oysters provide important ecosystem services, but they also are important for Gulf Coast communities, and that's both culturally and economically. Gulf oyster reefs account for 67% of the nation's annual harvest. And so they're important both for the environment and for communities in the Gulf region. The BP spill had a major impact on oyster reef health in the Gulf, and oyster reef restoration has been one of the most impactful management options used to address oyster reef declines. It is also one of the most widely supported management actions by stakeholders on the Gulf Coast. And here in these photos, you can see that there are a variety of different ways that oyster reef restoration is done, and these are just a few examples. So there are many more. Our second key motivation for conducting this study is that local communities rely on newspapers for environmental information. So, compared to television and radio, newspapers coincide with higher levels of knowledge about coastal and ocean issues in the US. And media coverage of environmental issues has been shown to influence public discourse in support for conservation action. Media framing of environmental disasters can influence public interpretation of technical details, policy, and management actions. And framing is what we used in this study to analyze our newspaper articles. So I just want to take a minute to make sure everybody's on the same page with what framing is. So here are three newspapers that look at oysters in the Gulf. So on the left, we have We Will Make BP Pay. This is Obama talking about the Gulf oil spill. In the center, we have purchase of an aquaculture facility. And on the right, we have a story about a volunteer oyster restoration project. So, how would these be framed? How would we say these stories were framed? On the left, we're saying this is a political frame. So this story is being told in a political way. There may be some other messages within the story, but the dominant message is a political one. In the center, we're saying that's an example of an economic frame. And on the right, that's a community frame. So if you just keep this in mind, this will come in handy when we talk about our methods and findings later on in the presentation. Our third key motivation is that news shifts during environmental disasters have been little studied, and so has general coverage of oyster restoration. So, how oyster restoration has been covered in the news. That has not been studied very much as well. So, there's a gap in the literature on how news media covers these issues, and the oyster restoration and the BP spill really provides a perfect model to study this in the Gulf. So these motivations influenced our research questions, and we have three research questions that we want to present to you today. The first is, how are efforts to restore oyster reefs represented by local and national newspapers from 5 U.S. Gulf states? How are the types of sources quoted in stories about oyster restoration associated with types of article frames? And how do frames and sources in oyster restoration news stories change when an environmental disaster occurs? And as you probably have guessed, that environmental disaster we're looking at is the BP spill. So here's a rundown of our methods. This map shows the locations of all of the local newspapers we sampled from. So we began with a sample of 1,020 articles, but once we cleaned that data, we were left with 763 articles. So we took out mostly community calendar articles or articles that did not have a clear frame. So 695, the bulk of that sample were local stories, and then we had a small national sample as a basis of comparison, so that was 68. And we found, you'll see as we go out, we don't really pull out the national findings because they really coincided with the local findings that we found for this study. So our sample was selected by looking at the 3 newspapers with the most articles about oyster restoration in each of the 5 Gulf states. And then we had 3 national papers as a basis of comparison. And those were the 3 highest circulation national papers in the country. We coded for article frame, types of sources quoted, as well as other variables. And then we coded whether articles were published before, during, or after the BP spill. And we divided those up into 2-year periods. So before was from 2008 to 2010, during was from 2010 to 2012, and after was 2012 to 2014. And we had a Scots pi range from 0.63 to 0.89 for coding these articles. So we also used some theoretical frameworks to guide our study, and I just want to briefly touch on those. We looked at the quantity of coverage theory, which this theory suggests that news organizations influence public perception of environmental risks more through the quantity of coverage and repetition of simple images than by presenting detailed content. So we believe that the quantity of coverage theory predicts the frequencies of stories published about oyster restoration will increase during and after the spill. And then we also looked at the social responsibility theory, and this theory asserts that the primary responsibility of journalists is to provide the public with an accurate understanding of the truth so the public can participate in democracy in an informed manner. So this theory predicts an increase in the diversity of sources included in oyster restoration coverage, during and after the spill. So here's a look at overall what we found in these articles. This is the number of oyster restoration articles published. So the green is before, the more yellow green is during, and then after is represented by blue. And you can see that the most of the articles that we coded were in the during phase. So that was 363 articles, and there were more articles after the spill than before. So we did find evidence to support our prediction with the quantity of coverage theory. Now if we look at the newspaper frames that were coded before, during, and after the BP spill, you can see here green is before, the more yellow green is during, and blue is after. And on the bottom you have the different frames that we coded. Environmental frames were the most common in all 3 periods, before, during, and after. And there was a slight change where we saw a slight increase in the during period, but really not too much of a change because it was overwhelmingly the most common frame throughout. Economic frames were the second most common. We did see kind of a stair-step increase throughout, so an increase during and then another increase in the after period. Community frames, we saw a slight increase during and then a decrease after. And political frames, there were more before the spill in what we were coding, which were these oyster restoration stories, than during or after. Seafood and tourism frames were not very common in our sample. So our key findings on frames were that environmental frames were by far the most common, so that's the most common way this story was told in the newspapers that we looked at, and that significant shifts were associated with the BP spill. So economic frames significantly increased in the after period, and community frames significantly increased in the during period. Then we looked at sources before, during, and after the spill. So this graph is similar to the previous one in the before, during, and after colors, but on the bottom, instead of frames, we have different sources that were coded. And when we say sources, we're talking about what we call primary definers, or the first quoted source. So instead of looking at all the sources quoted in an article, we're looking at the very first one, which really sets the tone or the stage for an article. And you can see that managers were by far coded more than any other group. They were coded frequently in all three periods. Then in the other category, that represented lawyers, journalists, and miscellaneous. That was the second most common group. And then politicians, scientists, fishermen, and the seafood industry. So we saw some evidence to support the social responsibility theory, but those margins were slim. Overall, we saw a very singular story that was represented primarily by natural resource managers. Notice that there was an increase in political sources in the after period, even though we did not see an increase in political frames. So that was an interesting finding. And then we saw that scientists, there was an increase in the during period, and then a slight increase after. To note as well, fishermen and seafood industry were very uncommonly quoted. So they were the least frequently quoted groups in our sample. So their stories were really not being represented in the newspaper articles we were looking at. So our key findings here were that managers were the most dominant perspective, with over 27% of sources represented by them. Scientists, even though there were not a ton of scientists quoted, they were significantly associated with environmental frames. So if there was an environmental story, it was more likely to include a scientist than other frames. Managers were significantly associated with economic frames, and fishermen and seafood industry representatives were not frequently quoted. So our main takeaways were that the public receives a more diverse story when a disaster occurs. So we saw some diversities in sources, but it's still not very diverse. And you could see that by the lack of fishermen and seafood industry reps that were included in those stories. Managers define what the public knows about oyster restoration. They are the primary definers. They are quoted more than other sources. And as I said before, fishermen are really left out. And even though scientists were not the most commonly quoted source, we did see that they are significantly associated with environmental stories. So those stories really rely on the perspective of scientists. So we just wanted to give some recommendations to help kind of guide the discussion forward. And one thing that we wanted to note is it's important to build institutional awareness of these differences and how stakeholder perspectives are portrayed in public media. And once you have an understanding of those differences, it's important for practitioners and policymakers to work to represent those diverse perspectives in management activities. So just because they're not quoted in newspaper articles doesn't mean they're not important. And that's something we really want to stress here. And then we also want to note that it's important to understand that environmental topics can be framed in many different ways. So even though it seems like one story, it can be many different stories depending on how it's told. And those frames can influence an individual's attitudes and behaviors. So we're hoping that these things kept in mind can kind of help guide policy and management activities. And so that is our presentation. We want to thank our funders for this research. Dr. Glenn Israel and I are here to answer questions, and we want to thank you so much for tuning in.